Welcome to the Mindful Academy podcast with me, Jennifer Askey. I'm a professional certified coach and academic workplace consultant. On this podcast, I talk about doing well personally so that you can perform well professionally. I talk about intentional career planning and about how to get out of your own way and align yourself with success. Thank you for joining me. Hello and welcome to the Mindful Academy. I'm Jennifer Askey, I'm your coach, and today I'm talking about imposter phenomenon or imposter syndrome. And I am going to begin with a definition. I am going to begin with the definition that dates back to its coining in 1978 by Clance and Innes. And in 1978, Clance and Innes refer to imposter phenomenon. And they write, quote, "Such admissions typically describe feelings of having ended up in esteemed roles, not because of merits or achievement, but because of some oversight on the part of important gatekeepers or due to sheer luck. Despite their objective success, these individuals express difficulty internalizing their achievements and accomplishments and worry that they may be uncovered as frauds," end quote. So I've been asked, as part of some of the work I do with academic impressions, to host a series of 3 over the course of the year. I think it's April, June, and August, 3-hour-long discussions online for academic impressions members about imposter syndrome. So I wanted to ground any discussion we have or any information I provide in peer-reviewed research. And so I went to the databases, I went to Google Scholar, and I did some digging around. And I found a couple things that I want to share with you today, both about the nature of, I'll call it imposter syndrome, because that's what trips off my tongue, because that's how I learned the phrase, but the nature of imposter syndrome and some of the pushback around it that is well overdue and super interesting for thinking about how you feel at work if you take on, say, an intersectional perspective. So I will begin with, I began with the definition that goes back to 1978, and they refer to imposter phenomenon, also imposter experience, fraud experience. Those terms are all synonyms for imposter syndrome. What is interesting to me about learning to use, say, imposter phenomenon or fraud experience, instead of saying imposter syndrome, is that it draws attention to the fact that a syndrome is a medical diagnosis and imposter syndrome isn't. It is also not a psychological diagnosis that exists in the DSM manual as it currently is out there in 2023. And the language of pathologizing this, right? Imposter syndrome, implying that it is a thing that exists and it exists on a spectrum, and somebody may have a mild case, somebody may have a more severe presentation of this existing phenomenon. It does a couple things. It very much personalizes it, right? It's a problem you have. It's a diagnosis you have that might need fixing. Right? So it personalizes something that I think we can recognize is a larger social phenomenon. And the way it gets personalized and the populations around which imposter syndrome get personalized are pretty interesting and apparent, because dating back to Clance and Innes's research in 1978, imposter syndrome is most frequently associated in popular discourse and in much academic discourse with women. So, do women have imposter syndrome? Do they have it more than men do, or to the exclusion of men? Is imposter syndrome something that women need to fix, right? All of these questions, fix about themselves, all of these questions are bound up in the naming of imposter syndrome rather than imposter phenomenon, and in the pathologizing of it, and the way that discourse weaves its way through literature. So this series of workshops that I'm doing for academic impressions, they've been requested by some members, and somebody reached out and said, "Jennifer, would you do these?" And I said, "I'd love to talk about imposter syndrome and why it's a whole load of bullshit and you should not have it." And that's, of course, super simple. Easier said than done. But this is a pilot project. Let's see what it is like to throw out an appointment for an hour-long online discussion on a topic that people have requested. And in very short order, we have over 420 people registered for this. And that is striking, right? That's an enormous number of people who are reaching out and saying, I am going to spend an hour of my time to learn about and talk about recognizing and resisting imposter syndrome. So, regardless of what my personal or your personal beliefs about owning up to imposter syndrome or combating or resisting imposter syndrome or the causes of it or whatever, regardless of that context, for me, the data point I'm beginning with is 420 plus people have signed up for an hour-long online discussion in academic circles about imposter syndrome. And so for me, this was another call, like, let's base what we're going to talk about or the information I'm going to provide in research. So I did some more digging. And one of the first pieces I came up with is, I'm going to pull up my Zotero here, is it's called Contextualizing the Imposter Syndrome, with syndrome in quotes, by Feenstra and Begeny and Ryan and Rink and Stoker and Jordan in Frontiers in Psychology in 2020. Okay, so what they point out is sort of a duh moment. So my first duh moment was syndrome is, of course, a misnomer because syndrome implies a recognized pathology when imposter syndrome doesn't have that, right? It's not in a diagnosis manual. It's a sense that people have, right? And according to initial research, the term imposter phenomenon comes on the scene associated with high-performing professional women, right? So it's a sense that many women have, and then it's pathologized as a syndrome. So that was kind of my first duh moment, like, oh, language is really important here and maybe deserves a little bit more careful parsing. The second duh moment for me was in this article on Frontiers in Psychology on contextualizing imposter syndrome, is that we know that imposter feelings are linked to marginalized groups in society. So when Clance and Innes were doing their research in the late 70s, right? I'm in grade school. I remember the late 70s. I remember my mother being on the job market. She was a teacher. I remember, actually, it was probably the very early 80s, like 81. She was talking about what she wore to interviews and how she got received there and whatnot. So 1978, thinking about women, high-performing women and imposter syndrome, the context there is super important, right? This is women who came of age during second wave feminism, entering the workforce in large numbers. The divorce rate is sky high, right? And the context that these women are entering is not particularly welcoming to them. So of course, they're going to feel like imposters. Carry that forward, right? Subsequent research on imposter syndrome has supports the 420 plus people who are showing up to an online discussion of this in April. Depending on the study you look at, anywhere from 9 to 82% of people who are surveyed in studies, if you look at meta reviews of imposter syndrome research, up to 82% of people surveyed say, yes, I have experienced something like this. And that cuts across gender lines, it cuts across race lines, it cuts across socioeconomic lines, but there are significant data points that show that the more marginalized your existence is in your industry, the more likely you are to feel like an imposter. So I think of the example here. The university I once worked at, I was I was teaching a class in the evening in a building I was not familiar with. And so I got there a little early and I'm wandering the halls, and it's an engineering building, and I'm teaching in a big lecture amphitheater. And it took me a while to find it. So I'm walking up and down the halls. And one of the halls in this engineering building had a picture of, I believe, not only all of the past deans of engineering, but all of the current and past department chairs. And they were just arrayed down this hallway. And it was a remarkable display of an entire hallway of white men. There might have been a couple men of color as you entered the 21st century, but by and large, it was a wall of all men and mostly white men. So as a, say, female student of color in one of those programs who walked past that hallway of, here are the greats of our field, when you are taking a class and struggling, when you fail an exam, when you feel like you don't understand something, you're going to look around you and think, well, maybe I'm not supposed to be here, right? We know from other things like media studies that representation actually matters, right? People can imagine what they can see. And so if you can't see yourself in an environment, it becomes more difficult to imagine yourself in that environment. And so you may question your success in that environment. Yes, I got in, but do I truly belong? Yes, I passed the class, but I didn't do it perfectly. Am I truly smart enough to be here? Right? Yeah, I got that award, but maybe I got it because I'm a woman of color, right? All of those things are part of the context of the imposter phenomenon, where it is not an individual, private, all by myself sort of feeling. People who experience that worry about being an imposter or a fraud are experiencing that in a specific context. And what does that context look like? Does it look like a place that is welcoming to the groups of people that your intersectional identity overlap with? Is it open and welcoming to you specifically? Do you have mentorship? Do you understand what the arc of growth is in that career or in that path, right? So if you don't have history, if you don't have institutional knowledge, if you don't have connections, if you don't look like the people there, that is a perfect recipe for feeling impostery. That's a great word, right? Impostery. And so this article in Frontiers in Psychology comes to the powerful conclusion that, again, as I said, was for me a bit of a duh moment, but I think it so much needs to be said out loud and articulated. The authors write, instead of framing individual insecurities that are prevalent or that we can see in marginalized groups solely as a problem that arises within those individuals, right, that bubbles up from within you, they argue that it's critical for research and understanding of this phenomenon to understand the context that gives rise to those feelings. Because here's the deal, you can pay $99 and go to an online seminar on banishing your imposter syndrome. And in these podcasts and in this session I'm going to give for academic impressions, I have some strategies, right? There are things that you can do on an individual level that push back against and resist imposter syndrome. But if your context never changes, then you'll be persistently surrounded by an environment that invites you to feel as if you do not belong, regardless of your success. Okay? So, as with so many things, right, the personal is the political, and there are structural implications here, organizational implications here. It is not a personal problem that individual people or even individual women, if we want to drive it home, need to go fix in themselves. So along those same lines, there is a very popular, in fact, it's one of the most frequently downloaded and read articles in Harvard Business Review by two authors. It was jointly written by Jodi Ann Burry and Ruchika Tulsian. And they were interviewed on Brene Brown's Dare to Lead podcast in October of 2021. Their article, which is called Don't Tell Women They Have Imposter Syndrome, or Stop Telling Women They Have Imposter Syndrome, in the Harvard Business Review, that was published in February of 2021. And it is going to, and it came out, I believe, at the beginning of 2022 as part of a Harvard Business Review article compendium book, okay? And what these two women argue quite compellingly, and these are two women of color, right? What they say is, like, the more we talk about women having imposter syndrome, right, the more we make it real, right? The more we normalize imposter syndrome as something that outsiders, and the less we offer space or create space to make some of those structural changes that need to happen in according to these authors, according to the authors in Frontiers of Psychology, right? If we're going to change what gives rise to imposter syndrome, it doesn't happen at the individual level, it happens at the structural level. But I'm just going to read one little snippet from the interview that the two authors of Stop Telling Women They Have Imposter Syndrome, their interview with Brene Brown. So I'm going to scroll a little bit while I do this so I get the names right. So Jodi Ann Bury in the interview says, this is sort of a synopsis of their argument. Okay. Let's dig into the first article. So this is their article, Stop Telling Women They Have Imposter Syndrome. She says, so imposter syndrome is this experience of not having an internal sense of your own success, despite the accolades, despite any accomplishments, anything that outsiders would clearly say, wow, you're successful. Internally, you can't see it and you don't believe it. And this is me now. She goes on to point out that it was initially coined in 1978 as imposter phenomenon, and it was something that Clance and Innes were observing in high-achieving women. Now, these authors put that in quotation marks because, like, high-achieving women in 1978 meant white, relatively well-educated, right, in a good position to enter the workforce in a way that correlated with achievement, right? And so she goes on to say, quote, but what that signaled to me was when you're high achieving, for me as a Black woman to be successful is to occupy more male and more white spaces. And so when I think about the observation of the lack of that internal sense of success, I'm looking at what's happening around me and what's creating that, okay? So they know that the more research we have conducted, the more research that has been conducted on imposter syndrome, the more we've seen the nuances of this. It isn't just women. It isn't just professional women. It isn't just high performers. It's lots of people, but it gets pathologized in women specifically. So Stop Telling Women They Have Imposter Syndrome is a really quick, pithy take on the larger issue of context that came up in this psychology article that points out that when we pathologize individual women for feeling insecure, we're ignoring this massive social context. So that's one of the main thrusts in the research, and that's the one I'm going to limit myself to today. The phenomenon of feeling like an imposter has also been researched. Like, what exactly does that look and feel like inside people? So now that I've sort of pushed back against individual pathologizing, I am going to switch to the fact that, yeah, 420 plus people have registered to to talk about it, that articles and books with imposter phenomenon syndrome, whatever in the title, sell, that it is a topic that people are talking about. To say the fact that it is culturally engendered, the fact that it is not your particular individual failing if you feel this way, that it is a real thing, but that we need to look at context and not just you. As a coach, I'm also a really big fan of let's start with what is within our zone of control. And frequently your responses to things are one place to start when I think about what is in your zone of control. So if you are feeling imposter phenomenon, look around you and see what's in my control here. So if, for example, you are feeling like an imposter and you are in an environment where your dissertation supervisor, your department chair, your dean, a colleague with seniority and status berates you in public, steals your ideas, mocks you, undercuts you, right? That might not be entirely in your control, or at least not right away. That's part of the context that is inviting imposter syndrome. But if you look around you and you see, well, I did get that award, I did get that job, I did get that thing published, and yet I find myself still feeling challenged with internalizing that feeling of success and owning it, right? Because I don't want to be seen as boastful, because the only thing that I think is good enough is perfect. One of the Marx brothers, right? I don't want to be part of any club that would have me. There's a little bit of that sometimes in academic imposter syndrome. So thinking about your own zone of control when it comes to how you feel, I want to quote again from the literature, and this is from this is from the American Society for Cell Biology. They have an interesting piece. So this is about STEM and the imposter syndrome. So faculty members and graduates, big postdocs and faculty members in STEM fields. And they did a survey, the authors did a survey and came up with 5 sources or 5 indicators of high imposter phenomenon feelings. And I'll name them and I'll give the examples from the article. So one thing that crops up a lot as a cause of imposter feelings is peer comparison. So feeling like you're not achieving as much as your colleagues of the same rank, that you lack some specific key training or methodology. Everybody knows things that you've never heard about, right? You feel like you're on your own and everybody else knows something that you don't know. This is also called compare and despair. I frequently, when my clients demonstrate this way of thinking about their own success, I have this amazing cartoon from the New Yorker that is an illustration of compare and despair. And the quote is, "Comparison is the thief of joy," and that is attributable to somebody whose name is going to escape me now that I'm talking about it. But comparison is the thief of joy, and comparison can also be the thief of self-acceptance. It can be the thief of self-respect and of internal confidence. So that's the first thing. The second is faculty evaluation. So this survey is looking at people who have jobs in the academy as professors, and if they're getting consistent feedback for years that says you're not doing enough, you're not publishing enough, your teaching isn't good enough, grant rejection rates are super high, so you're not getting that grant, paper rejections, revise and resubmit, 4 years worth of trying to get a bit of research published. That environment makes it really hard to wrap your head around what you're doing that actually is successful. So getting actual feedback that you're just not making the grade right now. What I think is really important about this is that the phenomenon here of like receiving feedback that you're not doing enough it's going to land harder and seem far more believable the more isolated you are. So in the peer comparison section, right, it's people know things and I don't know things, so I have to go off and find it figured out on my own, and then I wonder if I'm doing it right. And then this evaluation piece, like, oh, I keep getting these messages I'm not enough, and so I can't really wrap my brain around what I might be doing that is still successful. I think you can see in both of these instances how the more isolated you are, the louder these voices are going to be in your head, because you're not talking about your experiences with other people. They're not sharing their own path. Maybe you don't have mentors or peers that can say, aha, what is normal in terms of a rejection rate? What is normal in terms of teaching evaluation numbers? What is normal in terms of coming from graduate school or a postdoc into the academy as a tenure track professor? What's normal to know and what's normal to have to go figure out, right? Not normalizing imposter syndrome, but normalizing the growth curve, normalizing what acceptable is, normalizing what good enough is, and not creating this myth that, like, oh, some people have it and the rest of you don't, right? So there's a lot about isolation there that comes out for me. The third indicator or contributor to imposter feelings is public recognition. And so this is very counterintuitive. You get an award, you get singled out, and you think, oh, it actually wasn't that good. The panel of judges wasn't really evaluating the quality of my work. I think this is particularly pernicious if you are a member of a traditionally or historically marginalized group, right? Oh yeah, they're just giving it to me because, or it was my turn, right? I think this happens a lot in chair positions, where you're asked to lead a department because it's your turn, not because you were the choice. And so then embodying that modicum of authority, the being willing to take the lead on things and maybe put your stamp on things, that gets undermined because you don't feel like you've earned it, right? So sometimes public recognition actually feeds into imposter syndrome. The fourth element that people cite as contributing to imposter syndrome here is the anticipatory fear of not knowing. And I think this is a brilliant insight, right? I'll read their brief case study description of what this means from the article. I'm somewhat anxious about the questions I might get and whether or not I'm capable of answering them efficiently, because it's spontaneous. It's not a presentation. You never know what questions you're going to get. Those moments make me more anxious than the ones I can prepare and practice for. So this anticipatory fear of not knowing is the fear of being caught out. I think it is also a fear that goes hand in hand with interviews and conference presentations and job talks and the like, where there are spontaneous elements and you think, oh, is this where they figure out I don't know anything? Again, I think isolation, lack of network and support can amplify and magnify that. I remember my very first campus interview. I had not been in residence at my PhD granting institution for a while, so I probably didn't prep for on-campus interviews the way some of my peers had. I also was probably a little cocky and figured I knew what I was doing because my first round interviews had gone so well. And so just feeling caught off guard by things and thinking, oh, I blew that. Oh, because I don't really belong here, as opposed to I blew that because I didn't seek out ways to prepare myself, or it wasn't offered to me like, hey, Jennifer, do you want to prepare for on-campus interviews because they're a different breed of cat than the first round interview? Maybe that wasn't offered to me because people thought I would do a great job. Maybe it wasn't offered to me because I was totally incompetent and people knew I would blow it, right? Your brain can go in either one of those directions. And I think, again, isolation really contributes to that. The last element that Chakravarti cites in this article for the American Society for Cell Biology is a perceived lack of competency, right? So this is just flat out, I think they made the wrong choice in picking me. I don't know how I got in here. And I hear that all the time. I hear the last full-time university job I had where I was doing leadership development in the provost's office. I heard it from all sorts of people in really impactful staff roles and in faculty roles. Like, oh, one of these days they're going to realize that I'm just little old me, right? And that is sometimes false modesty, but it's also like, wow, I'm not sure I belong here. I think the fact that I heard this sentiment out of incredibly high-performing staff more than once, that they shared with me, well, I'm just a, girl from here, or I'm just a person who is like this, or I just have this color skin or this background and don't know why they hired me. I don't know anything. I think that, especially in an academic environment, being made to feel insufficient, like, oh yeah, I work here, but I don't have a PhD. Oh yeah, I work here, but I only do this, or I'm just here for the students or whatever. Like, there are ways that the academic environment itself can undercut feelings of accomplishment and that people take on wholeheartedly, right? Like, I'm not really very good at this, even though they've gotten the job, even though they were the top choice, right? So peer comparison, compare and despair, actual feedback, public recognition, the anticipatory fear of not knowing, and an actual perceived lack of competency. Those were the 5 primary valences of imposter phenomenon, or the things that brought the feelings on in this study that was published in a STEM journal. And I'll just invite you to think about, like, if you feel impostery at any point in time, do the situations that give rise to that, do you see them or hear them mirrored in those 5 major elements? Because I think they are pretty common. And I appreciate this anticipatory fear of not knowing, because it opens up the door to us acknowledging, like, there's a vague worry. I'm just vaguely worried about, like, being found out or not knowing what I should know. And I don't even know that I should know it, but I'm nervous that that will get found out in a really publicly humiliating way. I appreciate that because I think there's a lot of nuance there. So that is crowdsourced information about what imposter syndrome feels like and what gives rise to it. Now, I'm going to flip that a little bit here towards the last bit of the podcast and talk about another lens, another perspective on imposter syndrome. And here I'm going to borrow Carol Dweck's concept of the growth mindset. So the growth mindset is, and a lot of the preliminary research, not even preliminary, a lot of the foundational research on growth mindset looks at young people and children and people who believe that if first you don't succeed, try again, because you will eventually succeed because you will get the skills through trying and practice. That's a growth mindset. A fixed mindset is, my 3rd grade teacher told me I sucked at math, and I have never even tried since then because obviously I just suck at math and there's no helping me, right? That's an example of a fixed mindset. So here's one way to take the concept of growth mindset and apply it to feelings of imposter-y-ness. Let's take the position of a relatively new faculty member. You have a PhD, maybe you've had a postdoc, maybe you've done an interesting research project as part of your postdoc, maybe you've done some interesting pedagogical things, whatever. You arrive in a new place, in a new context with a new job. And that job has teaching, service, and research as part of it. If you are in the medical field, it'll have clinical things attached to that as well. And whatever your training was up until that point is going to give you a really good foundation in 1, maybe 2 of those areas. It's not going to give you a really firm foundation in all three. Or it'll give you a foundation, but it's not that firm, right? Were you taught how to teach? No? Well, then maybe you're going to feel like an imposter in the classroom because you currently don't have the toolkit to do that. And I will say that if you're feeling like an imposter, you're recognizing the gap between here's where I want to be and here's where I am. And the bigger that gap is, the more you're like, oh crap, I got to get on my game. The fact that you're noticing it and are concerned about it means that you're moving in the direction of that gap, or you're willing to do the things that will move you in the direction of closing that gap. This is the growth. This is where the growth mindset can help you. So if you come in to any new position, I'm using a faculty position, you come in and you realize, oh, goodness gracious, they hired me. I don't know how to do that. I can't get an R01 grant. I can't teach that big class. Whatever it is that you feel like you can't do that might feed into imposter syndrome. Well, instead of saying, well, I can't do that, I'm obviously the wrong person for the job. I obviously don't belong here. My colleagues obviously didn't have any other choice. They had to hire me, whatever. What about saying, oh, yeah, they brought me in here. I don't really know how to do that yet. So that's the next gap I close, right? And any big project worth doing is going to bring up for us, for all of us, hopefully, the sense of maybe being in a bit over our heads, right? Oh, wow, am I going to get this book written? Will I finish the dissertation? Will I get the job? Right? All of those moments where you thought, oh gosh, this is a very steep mountain and I am very much at the bottom of it. Recognizing that climbing the mountain in and of itself is work, right? And that you are supposed to be where you're at. And that as long as you're moving forward and making progress, then you're doing your job. As opposed to you are supposed to arrive fully baked, right? And I mean like fully cooked, not baked in any other sense. Get your mind out of the gutter. But I think, and this was very true for me, I think at one point in my faculty career, that I felt my version of imposter syndrome was everybody has it figured out and I don't. And by the time you had the job, and maybe had it for a couple of years, you were supposed to have it all figured out and you were supposed to feel done. Like, oh, I know it now. I get it now. I can do it now. And I didn't really ever feel like I got to that point. And some of it was I made life hard for myself, right? I never taught the same thing twice. I was always rewriting syllabi, right? Fiddling with things and trying to perfect them, which makes it harder to feel like you have arrived at a place of stability for a while. But what I've come to see now, doing a lot of reading and research on this, coaching hundreds of people who are at various places along academic paths, is the naturalness of entering into a new scenario at the bottom of a learning curve. Maybe not at the very beginning of the bottom, but somewhere in the bottom of the learning curve, and that your job is to grow into that role. And then maybe after whatever period of time elapses, when you get to the point where you feel stable, maybe you can rest there for a while. But then for most of us, we're going to get the itch again to grow. And so then you pivot in your research. You take on new teaching, you take on administrative duties, you switch institutions, right? Have a family, whatever the new project is, where again, you find yourself at the bottom of the growth curve. You're like, oh no, I don't know how to do this. That's right. And the work is to grow and transform through the act and through the actions of figuring out how to do this. So instead of like what I would like to posit as an alternative to imposter syndrome is an individual pathology that applies mainly to women. Go fix yourselves, right? What I would like to suggest is that a lot of times when people are self-reporting imposter syndrome, it might be helpful for them to say, oh, am I in the messy middle someplace in a big process? Am I in the messy middle of the tenure track? Am I in the messy middle of figuring out how to write grants or how to teach really good classes or how to write really well, how to get published? Am I learning that process? And it makes sense that at this stage in my career, I have not mastered that process. So I am growing. And growth is good, right? What Dweck talks about in mindset, about the growth mindset, is that the belief in your ability to put in the effort and get better at something is super important. Like, it's a major element of resilience. It's a major element of personal self-satisfaction and happiness, right? If we believe in ourselves, oh, we can overcome this. It's just going to require some hard work. That's great. And I know that for me, way back when, and I know that for other people that I coach right now, this notion that, like, well, I have the PhD and I got the job, so obviously that means I have all the tools. It's sort of presented somewhere along the way in this kind of work and job. We took that on from somewhere somehow as like, oh, well, if you get the job, that means that you're fully cooked. When it doesn't. It just means that you're on a new path that's going to require some growth. So if you are feeling impostery right now, where might you see this as, oh, this is just the uncomfortableness of growth. This is just the uncomfortableness of acquiring new skills, of gaining mastery. And yeah, it's a bit of a hard slog because a lot of things that are worth doing are a bit of a hard slog. So those are some initial thoughts on imposter syndrome. The next episode, I'm going to talk a little bit about imposter syndrome from a less academic researchy side and from a more pop culture side. And I will put in the show notes, figure out how to do that, the brief bibliography I have for this that has, it will have both sort of the pop culture stuff or the popular press stuff and the scholarly articles that I referenced. Other than the Harvard Business Review, most of them are easily accessible. HBR, you will want to access through your university's library because they will have a subscription. And otherwise it's quite expensive and restrictive. So I hope you found this interesting. I hope that the notion of the growth mindset as a counterbalance to feeling like an imposter is useful for you. If you have thoughts, rants, insights, I would love to hear them. Jennifer@jenniferaskey.com. You can also find me on LinkedIn. I look forward to hearing from you. I would love to hear what's on your mind right now. And in the meantime, take care. Talk to you soon. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Mindful Academy podcast. For questions about this episode, suggestions for future episodes, or to request a consultation with me, email me at jennifer@jenniferaskey.com. This episode was recorded in Edmonton, Alberta on Treaty 6 lands. The songs included in the intro and outro for this podcast are Heartache by Silent Partner and Piano Store by Jimmy Fontanez of Media Right Productions, both sourced through the audio library. Thank you so much for listening.